All right, well, today we are starting a new series called Circles, and we are going to talk about why life groups are so important to us as Deer Run Church. And the title, Why Life Groups Are Important, didn't sound as catchy as Circles, and so we went with Circles. Basically, the idea behind Circles is circles are better than rows. And we're going to talk about that and unpack that a little bit more as we go through this series. But the reason we're calling it Circles is because we believe that life groups are the heartbeat of this church. And as we continue to expand, as we continue to experience growth, we know that it's very, very important for us to sit in rows like this, but it's also it becomes easier and easier for us to, hide and to not be, noticed or for, just simply to be overlooked because the growth that's happening. And so we are looking forward to this. We're going to look at this for the next 3 weeks, so this Sunday and 2 more Sundays, and I think it's a very, very important topic for us. And so if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call during the week. Our theme for this year is Made for More. And when we talked about that, we talked about our primary calling, and later on in the year, we're going to pick up our secondary calling. And so in our primary calling, we really talked about that God has a call on all of our lives, and it doesn't only happen once we figured out all the details. So last Sunday, or the last few weeks, we've been talking about the phases, and we recognize that these phases that our families are in are also part of this theme, Made for More, because God has called us to be more in every area of our lives. And so we recognize that different family situations and all that is also part of it. But at the same time, we want to focus now on how life groups can help us discover how we are made for more. Now, you might be asking, what is a life group? What are we talking about? So you're telling us, why is life group so important? I don't even understand what you mean with life groups. So really quickly, just want to share with you. So life groups is a smaller gathering of followers of Christ facilitated by a leader. And this isn't some sort of a new phenomenon. When you go back in the New Testament, you see that there was already in the early Testament these gatherings of smaller people and smaller groups of people, and back then they called them churches. Why? Because that's all they had. They had these little house churches. They didn't gather in big, places like this because there simply wasn't church buildings back in those early days, especially in the early New Testament. And so they gathered in smaller circles, and they, would take care and provide for one another. Luke describes this type of group in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. And throughout the years, throughout the history of the church, we see that the values that the church had, even in the book of Acts already, were expressed over and over. And we today as a church continue to have those values. So some of them are simple things like healthy, independent functioning, in places where people can care for one another, where people can, meet and talk to each other, where they can share life together. So the reason we're calling them life groups instead of small groups or care groups or cell groups is because we believe there's something special about sharing life together, doing life together, knowing each other, knowing about the things that are going on in my life and connecting with people and other people's lives. And at times maybe it would be like, well, here's what's happening in my life, and someone else would go, oh, we had something similar to that happen once. And by sharing life together, we're able to encourage and be a blessing to each other. Now, we want to say, and when we first initially started life groups, we said that there were 3 key elements to life groups, to a healthy life group. The first one, and this is really why we have life groups, and the first one is this, relationships. And that's the one we're going to talk about mostly today. Relationships is this meaningful developed relationships with other people. A place where we can figure out life together. A place where we can know individuals. When you're in a large place like this, you simply cannot know everybody. Another element is growth. We want there to be growth. We want there to be spiritual growth, obviously, but we also want there to be growth in other areas of our lives. We want to be able to grow as a caring community. And then the final one is community change. Growth influences, groups influence their communities. Now, what community are we talking about? Well, it could be your life group community. It could be your larger community. It could be the community of Leamington. It could be the community of the church. But we don't want to be life groups that only focus on relationships and only focus on growth. Because when you are inward focused too long, it actually becomes toxic. So one of the key elements of our life group is that we want to be also outward focused, where we're taking care and loving and serving other people. In the next 3 services, we want to talk about these 3 elements as to why life groups are important. But this morning, I want to look specifically at relationships. And why are life groups important? Because of the healthy relationships that can develop within a life group. I want to share some information with you that, and I think this is encouraging. It's also something that is important for us to hear. But over the years, we've had a lot of growth here at Deer Run Church. And one of the things I love to do is when new people come in, I like to talk with them. I like to, and obviously I don't catch them all, but, we get to connect with people. And just a few months ago or a couple months ago, Maria and I were able to sit down and talk with somebody. And we're just kind of, listening to them and hearing, about how it was going. And one of the questions I love to ask them is, what was it like? How did we do? And why are you here? And what was your experience like? And this person shared something with us that, as usual, it's almost always encouraging. But even sometimes when it's not as encouraging, there's something that we can take and learn from. And this person said something that resonated with me because I'd heard something similar from other people. And I don't know about you, but sometimes someone says something, you're like, that says it the way we've always needed it to be said. Excuse me. They said it in a way that made sense, or it summed up what other people had been saying. And here's what this person said. You, as Deer Run Church, are a very friendly church. Let me just read it. Deer Run Church is a very friendly church, but there is a big difference between being friendly and friendship. And when I heard that, I was like, man, that summarized so much of what we've heard from other people, that we as a church, we want to be a church that reaches unchurched people. We want to be a church that makes everyone feel welcome. And what this person said was, this church is very friendly. Man, you are friendly. But they said there's a difference between just being friendly and friendship. So as we listened to that, I was like, man, that summarizes so well what I've heard. Now, what does that mean? What that means is something that we shouldn't see as negative. I think what that means is what is true for most of us. Most of us, we are great at being friendly. But when it comes to the next step, when it comes to inviting people over to our homes, when it comes to developing a relationship with them, when it comes to listening, when it comes to sharing life together, this is where many of us would rather remain just friendly instead of developing deep friendships. Thanks. And so I think this is a great opportunity for us to hear this and to say, you know what? Here is an opportunity for us to learn from someone's experience in us, in this church. I think many of us, if you're like me, we would rather show up here, do one of those, hey, how you doing? Shake a few hands, have a few laughs, sing some songs together, and then go about our day. And the reality of that is that doesn't develop deep friendships. This doesn't mean, and please don't hear that this person was saying that we don't care about people. This doesn't mean that we don't care about people. I know this church to care deeply for people. It just means that being friendly is easier than developing friendships. This conversation was a great reminder for me as to why life groups are so important to Deer Run Church. And so I think it's important for us to take some time and to look at this and why we want you to join in with into a life group. So what we're doing here this morning, by gathering like this is really, really important. Man, I'm having trouble with my water. There we go. What we're doing here this morning is really, really important. Gathering like this is great. And you need to know, some of the kids are probably sitting there going, hey, I'm hearing this. We're not supposed to be here. We're just supposed to be in circles. You're not, hey, we don't have to go to church anymore, Nope, that's not what I'm saying. Gathering like this is so important. Please hear that. But this can't be all church is. This isn't all church is. So these rows are important, but what we need to do is we need to circle up in other areas and other places in our lives because deep friendships are not developed in rows like this. So in order to develop friendships, we must do more than sit in rows. And if you look at the book of Acts chapter 2, the author, Luke, tells us about some of the things that the church is experiencing. And this is, an example for us often of what a church is to look like. But before we get to that, let's just notice this. This church has experienced tremendous growth. This church went from about 120 people to 3,000 people. And so we have to ask ourselves, and so with that growth, what was their primary, what was their main focus? What was the thing that they were, mostly paying attention to? What was the thing that they were, pressing in on? And obviously the first thing you'll see is that they continued to preach the gospel. But the other thing that you see is there's a way that they cared for one another. They weren't gathering in bigger buildings like this. They weren't having meetings about how to add on and how to expand, and all those things are important. But back then, they couldn't build something like this. They would have been arrested, and it would not have worked. And so one of the things that they did is let's continue preaching the gospel, but let's also develop deep relationships. They established a strong community, a healthy community. They developed meaningful, deep relationships. They took care of one another. They celebrated what God was doing. They were in awe of the work that God was doing in their midst, but they were constantly deepening these relationships, and as a result of that, people were drawn to them. So that's the introduction to this passage I want to look at really quick. Acts chapter 2, verses 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonderful signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. I think some people, when they hear this, they wrestle with, so are you saying we're supposed to all live in a communal housing place where we're supposed to have everything together? No, not at all. But what we need to see from this example, though, is that it was more than just about sitting in rows, hearing someone preach, and then getting on with their merry lives. This was a community of people that provided for one another. This was a community of people that cared for each other. Now, we need to remember that back then they had no social assistance. They had to learn to survive on their own. If somebody had a need or something like that, there wasn't really government assistance and social assistance back then for them. So what this early church did was they became a church that provided for not only the spiritual needs within their midst, but they also provided for the material needs that they had. 2 chapters later, we see that this was a foundational pillar of the early church. Acts chapter 4, verses 32. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed any of their possessions was their own. They shared everything they had. Now, some of you, this is where you get a little antsy. You're like, ooh, I don't like the sound of that. Okay, let's continue reading, though. With great power, the apostle continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there was no needy person among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from these sales, and put it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to everyone who had need. Church for them was never about coming and sitting in rows, singing a few songs, listening to a sermon, and going about their week, and then hitting repeat next weekend. The gospel was powerfully preached, and there was no needy person among them. The latter part of that should never be overlooked. I think we think of church, when we think of church, we think so much on just the gospel being preached. But what it says here is that there was no needy person among them, and that's all said together. So I want you to hear this very carefully. It is easy to focus on rows and neglect the circles. It is easy to focus on rows and neglect the circles, meaning that it's easy for us to just come together as a church and say, well, as long as we have preaching, as long as we have the Sunday morning service, as long as all of that is happening, then we're good. And we can neglect the circles, the care that is needed amongst us this morning. The argument could be made, and some of you are already maybe making that, well, if they didn't have social assistance back then, well, we have social assistance now, so therefore some of this doesn't apply to us today. And that's fair. It's a fair, thing to wrestle with. But I think it's important for us to see that what they were doing was an example of how we need to live as a church. They cared for each other. They provided for each other. And in that time, it was material things. And it was necessary for them to do that. Today, our needs are different. Today, our community has different kind of needs. We have assistance in some ways, but our needs now are in other areas. For example, loneliness. Loneliness is considered to be an epidemic in Canada. According to a study done by the International Psychogeriatrics, it said this: more people reported feeling moderate to severe loneliness during their late 20s, their mid-50s, and their late 80s than in any other life period. Meaning what? Meaning that right now in this room, we have people who are experiencing severe loneliness. And here's what we need to understand. Loneliness needs circles. Loneliness doesn't need rows. Loneliness needs circle. People who are struggling with loneliness, it's good to be in a row like this. It's good to listen to a sermon. But what loneliness really needs, what those people need, is a community to develop a relationship with them. Dilip Jets wrote this. He's from the San Diego Center of Healthy Aging. He says this: one thing to remember is that loneliness is subjective. Loneliness does not mean being alone. Loneliness does not mean not having friends. Loneliness is defined as subjective distress. It is the discrepancy between social relationships you want and the social relationships you have. Meaning this: that you can be sitting in a room full of people and experience loneliness. And that is why life groups are so important. Because if you are only in a place where you are in rows and you're surrounded by lots of people, you may experience some of these things. And until you are in a place where there are circles, until you are in a place where you are in a group that is listening to you, caring for you, that loneliness may never be addressed in your life. And loneliness is only one example that we could use. People need community. People need relationships. Whether it's loneliness, whether it's a family crisis, a health scare, financial struggles, marriage problems, and the list goes on and on and on. What is needed is not rows to sit in, but circles to be part of. And that is why we want you to consider and understand why we at Deer Run Church believe that life groups are so important. Jesus was constantly in circles with his disciples. He spent time with his disciples in a very personal way. He wasn't just, get into rows, we're going to have teaching now on how to care for people, and then he taught, and then, we'll see you next class. He traveled with his disciples. He sat in circles with his disciples. He was very personally engaged. He would ask them questions. What do people say about me? What are they saying? And he would talk to them in a very personal kind of a way. I was so pumped. I was looking through the New Testament, and I actually found a verse that says that Jesus was in a circle. And I was like, yes, this is awesome. Mark chapter 3, verses 34. And sorry, back that up. Shut that off quickly. Chapter 3, verse 34. This is the time where they come up to Jesus, and they're like, hey, Jesus, your mother and your brothers are outside, and they want to talk to you. And then Jesus has this to say to them. But look at what it says. He looked at those seated in a circle around him. I was so like, yeah, you can read the rest. Here are my mother and my brother. We're not focused on that. It's not, we're not, pulling that apart. But I was like, oh, there's a verse I can use. And it's so exciting. You guys are like, man, you are totally twisting Scripture. But there it is. One example, one literally saying, Jesus sat in circles, and we know that was something he did. That's how he cared for his disciples. He had a relationship with them. It wasn't just as a teacher. I think this is a scene that we would see repeated over and over. And one of the things that draws you to Christ isn't just that he's a phenomenal teacher, isn't just that he was a healer. One of the things that draws you to Christ is that you know you can have a relationship with Him. So why are life groups important to relationships? Really quickly, 4 things. Personal discovery. First, personal discovery happens when you are in a smaller setting. For a number of reasons. You can learn, you can ask questions, you can get involved, you can hear, you can be vulnerable, you can express your thoughts. That's just not possible in a setting like this. Some of you may be like, man, I don't really understand what you meant with that. Well, sorry, you just can't speak up in rows like this. It doesn't work. It would get confusing. But in a circle, you could actually stop and say, hey, that whole thing about loneliness, that's me right now. Man, I've been, in a place in my life where this, and this is happening. So it is a place for personal discovery. It's also a place where, when you're in circles, people can help you discover things about yourself. And I know in the life group that I'm in, we've had times where we just talk about, like, hey, here's what I'm struggling with. Here's something I don't know what to do with. And almost always someone in the group is going to be like, yeah, me too. I've experienced some of that. Or here's how I found my way through that. So one of the reasons life groups are so important is for you and I is for personal discovery. Number 2 is smaller is more effective. This is closely related to the first one, but smaller communities are more like, communities. When it's a large group like this, it's like, man, this is nice, but when you really need to be known, when you need to develop relationships, smaller is simply better. It works better. The bigger the group, the less transparency there will be. The bigger the group, the less vulnerability, even trust in some of those things. As the group gets larger, some of those things are challenged. You simply cannot know everyone all the time. And so it's important for us to be in these smaller circles so that we can develop these deeper relationships. And then number 3, deeper friendships. With that in mind, the third factor is that small groups help us develop deeper friendships with other people. When people know you, really know you, your life becomes more transparent. You begin to trust them in a deeper way. You begin to understand what they're going through, and you yourself feel that you are understood. And so that deeper friendship, you're not only friendly in your life group, you actually have deep, lasting friendships with each other. People learn to read you. And this can be scary. All of a sudden, it's like, man, we've been in a life group for 2-3 years. I kind of know what's up with you today. You don't look yourself. And in a larger circle like this, we can miss that. So one of the reasons that life groups are so important for relationship is that people actually begin to know you. And that can sound so threatening because they're like, oh, now they're going to want to know about the sin I'm struggling with and all those things. Accountability is so important. But here's the other thing. And I've seen this in our life group where we will challenge each other and say, hey, why do you think you can't apply for that raise? Why do you think that you can't go for that promotion? Man, you've got the skill for that. Some of the people in our life group are in university and high school, and so we at times talk to them, but then also us as adults, we talk about the things that are going on in our lives. And it's this deeper friendship where we know each other, we encourage each other, we hold each other accountable. That's why life groups are so important for relationships. And then lastly, maximum participation. You need a place where you can participate. You need a place where you can be involved, where people, where you have an opportunity to serve, where you have an opportunity to engage. Church life issues can be discussed openly. And maybe there's some things that are happening in the church sometimes, and you're like, man, I just would never dare myself to ask questions or clarifications in a large setting like this, but in a smaller circle, there I can participate and ask questions, and it's a healthy thing for us as a church. So those are the 4 reasons for why life groups are important for relationships. And my prayer is that if you are not in a life group, that you would consider, no one is telling, don't call me, don't email me and say I don't want to be told to get in a life group. I'm not telling you to do this. Well, our desire is that you would see the value behind this ministry and that you would incorporate it into your life. So here's some kind of closing thoughts. Right now in our church, we have 40 couples on a waiting list to be in a life group. That's 80 people waiting to be in a life group. Can I just speak to the 80 people for a moment, if you're one of those? Don't wait on us to get you into a life group. If you need to be in a life group and you need to be in a life group, we want to encourage you, find people who are waiting to be in a life group and take the initiative and get into a life group. That onus is on you as well. This isn't all just, we're going to find you somebody. I'm just saying it. It's on all of us. This is a ministry that we must all take ownership of. But at the same time, part of my vision for 2020 was that we would consider as life groups multiplying. We have 23 life groups right now, and when we initially launched life groups, we said we want life groups to be 3 types of groups: long-term life groups, short-term life groups, and more just topical life groups. And every one of you went long-term, meaning that we've got life groups now that have been together for a long, long time. And so we're simply saying, would you as a life group have a conversation and ask whether or not it's time for you to multiply? And that's a difficult conversation. And I know that that's going to be something, and if you're hearing, oh, we're forcing you to, no one said that. We're asking you to have that conversation. Why? Because life groups are the heartbeat behind this church, and we have many, many people who need to be in a life group. And so we're putting the onus on all of us. If you're in a life group, would you consider multiplying? If you're not in a life group, would you consider starting one? And that we all do our part, because we want church to be more than just rows. We want it to be circles where you develop deep relationships with one another and care and feel cared for. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for this morning. And I just pray that as we leave from here, that we would consider the importance of our involvement in the church. We thank you so much for this church. We thank you that we can care for each other. And I just pray that each one of us would now process this, and then that we would engage. Thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of the day.